بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode in our series on Islamic legal maxims, Al-Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya. We've discussed three of the major maxims and some of their corollaries. We've talked about al-umuru bi-maqasidiha. Matters are judged in light of their objectives. We've discussed al-yaqinu la yazulu bil-shak. Certainty is not displaced by doubt. We have discussed at considerable length al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. Hardship begets facility. And today's topic will be the fourth of the major legal maxims. Ad-dararu yuzal. Harm is to be eliminated. And many scholars have pointed out that the ultimate goal of the Sharia is to achieve maslaha for people, to achieve benefit for human beings, and to prevent harm. So, looked at from that angle, this maxim represents half of the entire concern of the Sharia, is preventing harm. Now, ad-darar is derived from the verb darra yadurru, which means to harm, to damage, to injure. And it can also mean to be harmful, to be injurious. So anything that harms people is called darar. And a more technical definition of it, Sheikh Muhammad Saeed Ramadan al-Bouti, he wrote a book called Dawabit al-Maslaha, the parameters of benefit in the Islamic Sharia. So in the course of his discussion, he defined darar as, translation of it, anything that impedes the achievement of benefit, maslaha, as a result of infringement, arbitrariness, or negligence. So the angle that he is highlighting here is the human element as a cause of harm. You can make a case, however, that there are other kinds of harm that this maxim can be understood to cover. For instance, Abdullah bin Umar, he said the dogs used to pass through the masjid during the era of the Prophet ﷺ. Dogs were basically stray. They would wander around. And at a certain point, the Prophet ﷺ ordered that dogs in the city of Medina be killed. And then after a certain number had been killed, he ordered that they be left alone. So the clear implication of that is that their numbers had increased to a point where they were posing some kind of danger to public safety or something like that. You know, people who live in the West, they would react to this report with horror, you know, because a dog is man's best friend in the West. And people even have cemeteries where they'll pay to bury their dogs. So The way that a dog acts when there's one dog in each household is pretty different from when dogs roam the streets as packs. You know, dogs are hunting animals and they hunt in packs. So when they're allowed to just roam like that in packs, they do pose public safety problems. And it's clear that the Prophet ﷺ wasn't intent on exterminating them altogether. He reduced their numbers until they no longer posed that problem. But in Al-Buti's definition, he highlights this issue of infringement, which means that harm that's caused by somebody taking somebody else's right. You know, there's a sense there of deliberate transgression. Ta'assuf, arbitrariness, is where you use your right, but you use it in a way that harms others. So, yes, it's your right, but you shouldn't be using it in that way. So that would also be covered by this definition. And as we talk about the Sharia evidence for this principle, we'll see an example of that. And then negligence. You didn't intend to do it, but you caused harm. So therefore, you know, that harm that resulted from your negligence needs to be addressed, needs to be eliminated. And harm could be public harm, a general harm, or it could be harm related to a specific person or a group. And the principle involves not only eliminating harm that's already existent, but also that harm should be prevented if possible. The English saying is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The overall principle of why darar should be eliminated, when it's defined in those human terms of transgression, arbitrariness, and negligence, they all involve some form of objectionable behavior, or munkar, and there are numerous texts that prohibit that and that encourage Muslims to eliminate it, to work for its elimination. And there's also the element of injustice when it's done in the sense of infringement and arbitrariness. The element of injustice enters, and the entire objective of the Sharia is focused on achieving justice in this life. As for everything, there are criteria for the application. As we mentioned with other things, if the means by which you're going to eliminate harm involves some kind of overriding of normal Sharia rules, then that harm has to be present and existent, not expected. As long as that harm is not present, then to override those Sharia-given rights of the right to choose in those issues, you can't do that. Also, the harm should be excessive. If a person is using his own property, you know, he goes out in his yard and he's beating his rug to knock the dirt out of it, dust out, and he does that once a month. His neighbor complains about that. His neighbor is not very justified in that because the dust is basically settling in the man's own yard, and it's a very rare event, and so why should that bother you? Another issue with regard to this is that the harm should not be lawful. For instance, a person objects to being punished for stealing because that will involve harm. You know, he's going to lose his hand. Well, you know, in this case, you've broken the law, and inflicting that kind of harm is actually prescribed by the Sharia. So that's not the kind of harm that's intended by this maxim. Also, the harm should interrupt a valid maslaha. So if a Muslim is selling liquor and he's got the bottles liquor there in the storage, and somebody came along and destroyed that, from a Sharia point of view, there's no restitution required for that, because that maslaha that he has interrupted by breaking those bottles is a maslaha that is totally rejected by the Sharia. Among the evidences for this qaida, in Surah An-Nisa, Allah says, "Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu la ta'kulu amwalakum baynakum bil batili illa an takuna tijaratan an taradin minkum." O you believe, do not consume one another's wealth wrongfully, rather let there be trade by mutual consent. So consuming people's wealth wrongfully inflicts harm on them, and a person who knows he's being harmed in a transaction would never give his consent, his freely given consent to it. And if we look at some of the other evidence for it, the most direct evidence for it is the hadith of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, where the Prophet ﷺ said, "La darar wa la dirar." So there's some discussion among scholars about what's the difference between darar and dirar. So there should be no darar and there should be no dirar. Darar, the dominant opinion is that darar is initiating harm, and dirar is reciprocating harm. Okay, somebody's harmed you and you harm them back in a way that's unlawful, so that's not allowed. And the Prophet ﷺ, this example of a man who owned a tree and it was in the orchard belonging to another man, we'll pick up inshallah after the break. Assalamu alaikum.
A friendly message by Dr. Zakir. Old Age Home.
Al-Quran, Surah Al-Isra, chapter number 17, verses number 23 and 24 says, "Your Lord has decreed that you worship none but Him, and that you be kind to parents. Whether one or both of them attain old age in your life, say not a word of contempt. Do not say oof to them, nor repel them, but address them in terms of honor. And out of kindness, lower to them the wing of humility and say, My Lord, bestow on them your mercy, even as they cherished me in childhood." There is no place for old age home in Islam.
Peace TV, the solution for humanity. Let's come under the shade of the scholars.
So the issue is a problem of knowledge.
Asim Al-Hakim.
Why do people do bid'ah?
Imam Malik said, whoever claims there is a good innovation in the deen,
Salim Al-Amri.
he is accusing that Prophet Muhammad did not convey the message.
Dr. Mamdouh Muhammad.
If you know that the Prophet ﷺ did something and I do something else, you have to follow the Prophet ﷺ. Don't follow me.
Abdul Rahim McCarthy.
But if each one believes his goal is to please Allah, to follow the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Abdul Rahim Green.
I think this really is to do with your internal state.
Where does the Quran and Sunnah point to?
Muhammad Al-Sharif.
We have to follow what Allah and His Messenger said.
Let's imbibe from these scholars the fruitful solutions for the problems of the world.
Which one we would take and which one we would leave?
Question to every Muslim.
In the shade of the scholars. Next on Peace TV.
Welcome back. We're talking about the case of a man during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. He owned one date palm tree that was in the orchard owned by another man. And it so happened that the man also, he had he built something there and he'd bring his family. This was the owner of the orchard. His family was there in the orchard, and this other person coming and going to tend his one date palm tree, it became, a source of difficulty for the family. And so the owner of the orchard, he approached the owner of the single tree and he said, "Would you sell me your date palm tree?" And he said, no, I want to keep my tree. So the man pleaded with this owner of this single tree, and he wouldn't budge. He used all means to discuss it with him rationally. He wouldn't budge. So he went to the Prophet ﷺ and he explained the case to him. The Prophet ﷺ called the man and he said, sell him your date palm tree. And he said, no. And then he said, well, make a gift of it to him and Allah will give you better than it in paradise. And he still refused. And so at that point, the Prophet ﷺ, he told him, Anta mudar. You are an inflictor of harm. And he also had another choice, which was to transplant it, dig it up, and put it somewhere else. So he had refused all of these reasonable requests. Finally, the Prophet ﷺ said, Anta mudar. And he turned to the owner of the orchard. He said, just uproot the tree and put it outside your wall. So that's an example of a person who had a right, but he used it in a way that he didn't have to. And by using his right and insisting on his personal property rights, he imposed difficulty and hardship on others. So that's what's called ta'assuf in Arabic, the arbitrary use of a right. And then you have all kinds of Quranic verses also which mention وَلَا يُضَارَ كَاتِبٌ وَلَا شَهِيدٌ. The person who writes down the contract for a loan and the witnesses, they should not be harmed. And the wording also allows it to mean that they should not cause harm. So for them to cause harm would to be somehow to falsify the contract or to falsify their testimony. So that's prohibited. And then there are verses that prohibit a man from taking back his wife in order to inflict harm upon her. So there are numerous evidences in the Quran also prohibiting darar. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Kullul Muslim ala Muslim haram. Everything pertaining to a Muslim is inviolate to another Muslim. Damuhu wa maluhu wa irduh. His blood, his property, and his honor. So applications of this maxim in fiqh, there are a great number. One example, which is very simple, very obvious, it's not lawful to break the speed limit. Now, if somebody who is just starting to study Sharia, their reaction might be, it's very conceivable to me to hear this kind of a thing, which is, it wasn't prohibited. Bring me a hadith, bring me a Quranic verse saying that I can't drive faster than the speed limit. The dalil for it is the general evidence prohibiting the inflicting of harm. So if those who are in a position of authority determine that, you know, on this road it's not safe to go more than 80 kilometers an hour, that means that they're looking out for public safety. If somebody breaks that rule, they are endangering others. If a person is a spendthrift, he's doing transactions where he keeps losing money, a judge can step and say, this person is under interdiction, al-hajr ala safih. He is not allowed to buy and sell without the permission of the court. Because if he's doing that and squandering his wealth and it puts his family into hardship as a result, then something needs to be done in order to prevent this harm or to eliminate the harm. Another situation in which this maxim would be invoked is a person who is criminally insane. There was a case I remember hearing about in China. This man was mentally disturbed and people were expressing concern about it and the authorities didn't do anything about it. And one day he ran amok. You know, he got an axe and he started chopping his neighbors up. And he managed to kill a couple of people before he was overpowered. And he was insane. So the responsible thing to do when a person is exhibiting those kind of symptoms is to have him diagnosed. If it's determined by qualified persons that this person is mentally unstable and poses a threat to other people, then something should be done about it. Another example of that was this young man who, his mother, I mean, she made a mistake. She was a gun collector in Connecticut, and the parents were divorced. The mother was raising the boy by herself, and she began to become uneasy about the boy. And he was exhibiting lots of disturbing behavior. And she began to make plans to have him put into a care facility where he wouldn't be able to harm people. And when he got wind of that, he ended up murdering his mother and then going on a killing spree at elementary school. So, I mean, she was trying to actually prevent harm, but, you know, she was overtaken by events. When you look at examples of this maxim in the context of Islamic finance, an Islamic bank should not provide financing for businesses that are harmful. So clearly, if the thing that they're making is haram, then you can't finance it. There are certain things which are lawful from a certain angle, but they can be used for harm. So companies that make assault weapons, should an Islamic bank be involved in financing the activities of such companies? You know, if these are being sold to the general public, then a very strong case could be made that no, because what do you as an individual citizen need an assault rifle for? So when you have these recurring cases of people with mental problems going into public places and killing people using these kind of weapons, then that's not something that should be aided and abetted. The Central Bank of Malaysia, they stepped in at a certain point when they saw that people were using credit cards and they were defaulting on them. The number of defaults on credit cards became alarmingly high. And so the bank stepped in, made new regulations which made it much more difficult for consumers to get credit cards unless they met certain income requirements. Now, the whole issue of credit cards is another issue which we don't have time to go into here. Obviously, your basic credit card poses all kinds of Islamic problems. Another example of this is that you have a phenomenon, for instance, insider trading. Stocks are sold on the stock market, and if you know that a certain stock, a certain company, that they're going to enter into a deal which is going to make them much more valuable, and you're in a position to buy and sell stocks, then you could make a lot of money off of that insider knowledge. So insider trading is prohibited because your knowledge will allow you to make money at the expense of other people. So the regulators have an obligation to step in and punish people for doing that, for other kind of antisocial business activities like hoarding. All of those activities that went unpunished in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, those are the kind of things that should be punished. You know, in America, the government claimed that, well, these practices might be unsavory, but they're really hard to convict a person on in court. And William Black, who's a professor of economics and who was involved in prosecuting cases of this sort in the 1980s, when there was another great crisis, a meltdown of the savings and loans institutions, he prosecuted and put well over 100, I can't remember the exact number, but put hundreds of criminally liable and transgressant bank presidents and officials in prison. So where there's a will, a political will, there is a way. And when there's no will, then, oh, we just can't do it. So these are some of the manifestations of this principle of harm is to be eliminated. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.